Arthur opened the door cautiously. As soon as he saw who was standing in front of him, his expression immediately turned surprised. Director Goodsky was smiling broadly, while beside him stood two very familiar figures, Lance Barron and Lance Elia. Claire, who was standing next to Arthur, immediately showed an enthusiastic and pleased expression. However, tension hung in the air, in contrast to the excitement radiating from Claire. Director Goodsky broke the silence with a warm and excited voice. He introduced Lance Barron and Lance Elia as the day's special guests. Claire couldn't help the huge smile that graced her face. She felt very honored and excited, even aspiring to one day be like them. Meanwhile, Lance Barron looked at Arthur with a cynical and sharp gaze, as if he wanted to convey a message that only the two of them understood. Arthur returned the gaze coldly, feeling the dissatisfaction that created tension between them. Lance Elia, realizing the tension, turned to Claire with warm support. He placed his hand on her shoulder and encouraged her. As Lance Barron and Lance Elia left the room, Arthur stepped into Director Goodsky's office. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and there was a sense of uncertainty hanging in the air. Director Goodsky, an authoritative man with a serious expression, greeted Arthur politely. He asked Arthur to sit down to discuss an important matter. Arthur sat down with curiosity and some trepidation. He asked about the reason for Lance Barron and Lance Elia's presence, which was not just to say hello. Director Goodsky explained that Lance Barron, who used to be a student at the academy, had come to meet with his sister to deliver an important message. Arthur was surprised because he did not expect to meet such a famous figure. Director Goodsky added that they brought better news, although his statement only sounded faint to Arthur's ears. Director Goodsky then turned his attention to the problem that had just occurred in the last class. Arthur explained the incident involving Lucas, Charles, and Marcos interrupting them after class, citing dissatisfaction with the exam results and trying to intimidate them. Despite the tense situation, Arthur and his friends managed to keep their composure and avoid a big mess. Director Goodsky appreciated the calmness shown by Arthur and his friends and reminded them to report any further problems. Not long after, Claire entered the room with a worried look on her face. After listening to the brief explanation of the meeting with Lance Barron and Lance Elia and the discussion with Director Goodsky, Claire wondered about the possible important news that the guest might bring. Director Goodsky warned that the world outside the academy was more complex than they imagined and emphasized the importance of staying alert. With this warning, Arthur and Claire realized that their journey was still long and full of challenges. They need to be prepared for what may come, including news that may change everything. The meeting may have ended, but their journey had just begun. Director Goodsky then changed the subject and asked Arthur to explain the events that happened in the last class. Arthur straightened his back, feeling the tension wash over him. He recounted in detail the incident that occurred after class, where Lucas, Charles, and Marcos followed and confronted him. Director Goodsky sat at his desk with his gaze focused on the large window overlooking the garden. His thoughts drifted far away, considering Arthur's explanation of the situation involving Marcos. Marco's unusual demeanor, his erratic magical outbursts, his magical abilities that exceeded normal limits, as well as the blood symbol engraved on his spine, were all running through his mind. Arthur waited patiently, feeling the tension that enveloped the room. He couldn't ignore the impression that Director Goodsky was holding something back. Every detail Arthur revealed seemed to add more weight to the director's shoulders. Cautiously, Arthur asked questions about Director Goodsky's knowledge of Marcos. Director Goodsky looked away from the window and gave Arthur a serious look. He explained that neither the medical team nor the artifacts have found a definitive answer regarding Marcos' situation. Director Goodsky had also asked the Mages Guild to send a researcher to work with Gideon in investigating the case, hoping that a solution could be found as soon as possible. Arthur nodded, although his heart was not completely at ease. The uncertainty regarding Marcos was deepening, and it was clear that Director Goodsky was also feeling this burden. Both hoped that an explanation would be found soon. After the tense meeting, Director Goodsky sat behind his desk, frowning as he thought about the situation at hand. Security at the school was getting more and more urgent, and he knew that they couldn't just rely on routine patrols. He decided to increase surveillance between classes by placing additional staff to help out at night, avoiding further risks. Claire, who was sitting across the table, nodded in understanding. The look on her face showed an understanding of the seriousness of this matter. Director Goodsky then looked at Arthur, who was standing beside Claire, with gratitude. Arthur, with his abilities that were much needed by DC officers, was expected to deal with the lurking threat. Director Goodsky expressed his gratitude to Arthur and emphasized that Arthur's help was invaluable. Arthur simply nodded, keeping his composure despite the worsening situation outside. He knew the responsibility that lay on his shoulders and felt ready to face it. When they left Director Goodsky's office, the atmosphere outside was tense. Director Goodsky looked at them with a gaze that was hard to interpret, implying both worry and hope. His gaze reflected that danger was always lurking, and that the decisions they made would determine the future of this school. The door to Director Goodsky's room closed quietly, leaving a silence that surrounded every corner of the room. In this silent atmosphere, a large eagle suddenly appeared, flying gracefully before landing on the director's desk. He was called Avier. The eagle's sharp eyes glittered in the dim light of the room. The eagle let out a hoarse yet firm voice, voicing its concerns regarding the need to involve the students. Director Goodsky nodded slowly, pondering the hawk's words with a heart full of difficult decisions. He realized that sacrifices might be necessary, but he also understood the fact that they had come to a point where decisions had to be made. The room was again enveloped in silence, with Director Goodsky lost in his own thoughts. He mumbled to himself, his mind drifting to the enemies that continued to lurk. Disappointment and confusion seemed to mix in his voice, signaling deep frustration. In the corner of the room, Lance Barron and Lucas were engaged in a serious conversation. Arthur found it strange to see Lucas, who was known to be arrogant, speaking respectfully to his brother. Inwardly, Arthur pondered how easily Lucas showed a different side in front of Lance, as if all his arrogance vanished instantly. The memory of Caspian's words came back to him: strength without purpose is just an illusion, and being strong is meaningless if you can't face the real challenges. Arthur remembered the threat that lurked, Lucas with Lance Barron as his protector. Arthur realized that now was not the time to act. Fighting Lucas with Lance Barron behind him was impossible. Now was the time to prepare. With a heavy heart, Arthur resumed his steps, determined to gather strength and strategy, waiting for the right moment to face the challenge ahead of him. Amidst the tense silence, Arthur and Syl focused on the discussion between Lance Barron and Lucas. The tension in the air was thick, and the calm atmosphere was suddenly broken when a gleaming sword appeared right in front of Arthur's face. His fighting instincts peaked, thinking an enemy had appeared before him. However, as his vision sharpened, he realized that the owner of the sword was Lance Alia, who stood with a solemn expression. Lance Alia explained that although Lance Barron was known to be the strongest, he was still unable to match the level of reception possessed by Lance Alia. Lance Alia's voice was soft yet confident, creating an atmosphere of reverence between them. Arthur looked pensive, thinking about the words that had just been spoken. In his mind, the comparison between strength and ability was not just a number, but also a long journey taken by each individual. Arthur asked about Lance Alia's strength, and Lance Alia replied in a jokey manner, spreading his arms slightly, as if he wanted to answer the question with a joke. Seeing Arthur's cold response, Lance Alia sighed, hoping to break the ice with a little humor. She admitted that she was the weakest of the Lances, and there was a huge gap between her and the others. Arthur bowed his head, showing deep respect. Lance Alia smiled, gently stroking Arthur's hair with deep affection. After thanking them, Lance Alia and Lance Barron departed, leaving Arthur in a meaningful silence. As they walked away, Arthur felt as if a new chapter in his life had begun, a meeting that not only increased his knowledge, but also opened his heart to new possibilities in the future. Arthur strode slowly along the corridors of Tyrus Academy, enjoying the tranquility of a normally pleasant morning. However, it was soon interrupted by the sound of whispers coming from a group of students standing near one of the classrooms. Curious as to what was being discussed, Arthur approached. As he got closer, he heard the shocking news. One of the students was talking about Marcos, who was known for his temperamental attitude and often caused trouble at the academy. This time, the rumors sounded more serious, about his fight with Arthur. With a heavy heart, Arthur continued his steps towards the disciplinary committee room. Sylve, who was always ready to support him, followed quietly. When they arrived at the door of the committee room, Arthur felt the tension that enveloped the atmosphere around him. When the door opened, they were greeted by an unusual sight. The members of the disciplinary committee had gathered in the room, with faces that looked anxious and confused. Amidst the crowd, Arthur spotted Claire, who looked more serious than usual. Claire immediately noticed Arthur's arrival and approached him with an expression full of concern. With a voice full of sadness, Claire announced that Marcos had died. The news hit Arthur like a thunderbolt in broad daylight, making him feel as if the walls around him were crumbling. Arthur could not hide his shock. Although he knew that Marcos often acted recklessly, he never imagined that the situation would end in death. Claire explained how last night's incident happened, with every word spoken adding to the shock and sadness in Arthur's heart. Marcos' death serves as a reminder of how serious the consequences of impulsive and hateful actions can be. As sadness and regret wash over him, Arthur realizes that their world is not as easy as it seems. Marcos' death was not only an ending, but also a call to action. Arthur realized that he could not let this kind of tragedy happen again. Arthur was stunned to hear the sad news of Marcos' death. The news seemed to break the silence in the room. Claire, who brought the news, was visibly grief-stricken. Her emotions were evident as she attempted to explain the circumstances surrounding Marcos' death. Claire took a deep breath. She announced that the medical artifact that treated Marcos was unable to stop the leakage of his mana. This explanation only added to the confusion and worry that already filled Arthur's heart. He had a hard time imagining how someone with such great power like Marcos could fall into such a miserable state. The information provided also included the symbol on Marcos' back, but the information obtained from medical artifacts was few and inadequate. The difficulty in uncovering the true cause of Marcos' death placed a heavy burden on the members of the disciplinary committee present in the room. The room was filled with tension. The faces of the committee members were tense, reflecting the seriousness of the situation. The oppressive silence seemed to suffocate them, each second feeling heavier and heavier. Suddenly, a large man sitting at the end of the table banged the table hard. It was Theo. The thud echoed through the room, breaking the silence and adding to the already tense atmosphere. Anger and frustration were evident in his expression, expressing dissatisfaction with the situation they were in. Claire, trying to calm the situation, proposed to strengthen their patrols. This decision was the first step towards addressing a threat that was not yet fully understood. Arthur, who felt the growing weight of responsibility on his shoulders, realized that their next actions would determine the future of the community. With growing determination, Arthur promised himself to delve deeper. He is determined to uncover the truth behind the mysterious symbol that has ruined Marcos' life. The darkness lurks ever closer, but with cooperation and courage, they have hope to face the impending threat. The footsteps of the 3 discipline committee members echo through the school corridors as they make their way to class. Arthur, Cathiel, and Ferrith walk together, engaged in light conversation regarding their patrol schedule. Ferrith glanced at Arthur curiously, asking if Arthur would be okay patrolling with Theodore. Arthur shrugged and smiled casually, explaining that although he didn't really care, the schedule was indeed wise considering the number of classes he had to attend. There was a note of hesitation in his voice, indicating discomfort at starting the patrol so slowly. Kathleen responded encouragingly, reminding him that the object Arthur carried in his pocket should serve as a communication tool, not just a display. Arthur grabbed the object and looked at it for a moment, surprised by its surprisingly useful function. Kathleen smiled, expressing her surprise at deciding to patrol alone in such a large school. Ferrith, who was listening, added a warning about Kai, who was notorious and often avoided work. Arthur tried to be optimistic, thinking that perhaps Kai was just tired of patrolling. He then glanced at Kathleen with concern, expressing regret at not being able to patrol together and judging that Kathleen's sister disapproved of him greatly. Kathleen explained that she only told her brother that Arthur became her friend after a few touches, which explained her brother's anxiety. Arthur frowned, understanding the reason behind Kathleen's brother's anxiety. Ferrith glanced at Arthur sarcastically, reprimanding his seemingly unserious demeanor. Kathleen and Ferrith finally entered the classroom first, leaving Arthur standing outside for a moment. In a slightly mocking tone, Arthur bid farewell to them, who didn't seem to hear him as they were focused on their own conversation. Arthur was left in a hanging silence. Arthur shook his head and smiled to himself. His days at this school were never dull. Arthur entered the classroom with excitement. The atmosphere in the room was noisy with whispers of students who seemed enthusiastic about discussing the previous lesson. He immediately stepped forward and asked his friends questions about the topic discussed yesterday. Some students looked at Arthur curiously. He continued by asking if the color of the mana core used in mapping the power level was really accurate. Ferrith, who was sitting on the center bench, immediately raised her hand confidently. He explained that, in his opinion, the mana core was a clever method to accurately determine one's strength. However, in the middle of her explanation, whispers began to be heard among the other students. They exchanged glances and wondered if the answer to the question was already known to one of the DCs. One student stated that Ferrith would definitely give the answer. Ferrith continued her answer in more detail, trying to demonstrate her knowledge. However, as he was explaining, Arthur couldn't help himself and declared that Ferrith's answer was wrong. Ferrith's expression instantly changed. His face was sullen and bright red with embarrassment and anger. The class went silent for a moment before laughter erupted from several students who couldn't contain their reactions. Some students laughed and asked how Ferrith could be so sure and yet turn out to be wrong. Ferrith looked down, her face turning even redder. Despite being known as a bright student, this moment seemed to shatter his confidence. Arthur saw his friend's reactions and felt a little guilty, even though he knew that honesty was an important part of the learning process. Arthur stood in front of the class with a sharp, focused gaze. He began his explanation confidently, outlining that mana cores could not be used to judge a wizard's overall ability. He emphasized that reaction speed, combat sense, spell comprehension, and various other factors were important elements that could not be ignored. He compared this to judging a warrior's ability based solely on their muscle size. Some of the students in the class started nodding, understanding the truth behind Arthur's statement. He continued that while someone may look strong based on appearance, it does not guarantee that the person is a great fighter. A male student raised his hand, expressing his curiosity about how to measure an opponent's strength. Arthur gave an unexpected answer, suggesting that they do nothing. The class was silent for a moment, confused by the answer. Some students began to exchange glances, trying to understand the meaning behind Arthur's words. Arthur then suggested that they should assume that their opponents were stronger than themselves. He emphasized the importance of thinking this way as a strategy. Arthur asked a rhetorical question about what to do if the opponent turned out to be weaker than they thought, emphasizing that underestimating the opponent is a big mistake. He explained that every fight depends on proper strategy and judgment, and if they do not respect the opponent, the result could be surprising. The mood of the class began to change, with some students starting to take notes while others pondered. Arthur was proud to see the impact of his teachings. He realized that in a world full of wonder and danger, Knowledge and strategy are the strongest weapons. As the class came to life, Arthur smiled, satisfied that he had not only taught techniques, but also the right way to think about fighting. After the class ended, Arthur and Sylve entered a quiet room. The room was filled with rows of benches facing a large window. Among the many benches, Tessia sat down, and Sylve immediately ran to her with excitement. Sylve's face lit up as she greeted Tessia with excitement. Tessia turned her head, her smile brightening at the sight of Sylve, and immediately gave her a warm hug. However, the smile soon faded when Arthur approached and sat beside Tessia. Tessia just glanced at Arthur without saying a word. Silence enveloped the room, and the atmosphere became hushed as they were each lost in their own thoughts. Sylve, who was so happy to see Tessia, didn't seem to notice the tension that surrounded the relationship between Arthur and Tessia. Finally, Tessia broke the silence by speaking. She stated that Arthur did not need to give any explanation. Arthur, confused by Tessia's direction, looked at her with a questioning gaze. Tessia continued that she felt she had overreacted yesterday by saying things she shouldn't have said and didn't want to. Arthur nodded slowly, feeling the same emotional burden. He recognized that Tessia's words yesterday contained a lot of truth. In his heart, Arthur felt that he understood Tessia's feelings, but fear prevented him from confronting her. He realized that emotions were much more complicated than combat or magic. Arthur felt an emptiness inside him and realized that physical training alone was not enough to deal with the complexity of these feelings. Tessia looks at Arthur seriously and admits that she has also lost control of her emotions. Tessia revealed that Lilia had asked her not to discuss this matter with anyone. Hearing Tessia's statement, Arthur's heart trembled. He firmly stated that Tessia was much better than him. Arthur felt that she was always trying to run away from trouble, and he believed Tessia did not deserve such treatment. Arthur's words hung in the air, creating a heavy silence between them. Arthur sensed the vulnerability in her voice and realized that this was a crucial moment. In the silence, they stared at each other, trying to find the strength to express their pent-up feelings. This silence was more than just silence. It was a space where two wounded souls tried to understand each other, even though words were hard to say. Arthur knew that beneath the complexity of these emotions, there was hope to support each other. Arthur delivered his decision softly, revealing that he did not want a relationship with Tessia at this time. The words hung in the air, and Tessia and Sylve's reactions were immediately apparent. Tessia looked shocked and saddened, as if Arthur's words had pierced her deepest feelings. Arthur sensed the heavy emotional weight between them, hoping that the explanation might bring some clarity. Tessia lifted her face, with hopeful eyes that were quickly fading. Arthur felt awkward, trying to find the right words even though his heart was full of doubts. He realized that this decision might leave Tessia speechless for a moment, and was distressed by the fact that Tessia might not wait. Sylve, who was on his lap, watched curiously, not fully understanding the dynamic between them. Arthur felt the turmoil inside him, not knowing how to explain his complicated feelings. He didn't want to hurt Tessia, but also felt unprepared for the situation. He tried to clarify his decision, but found it difficult to continue. Her heart was conflicted between the desire to explain and the fear of disappointing. Tessia seemed to understand without the need for further explanation, and Arthur felt a heaviness in his chest. He apologized and revealed that he just needed time. A silence falls over the room, where Arthur feels that this decision is difficult, but sometimes it is necessary to give distance and time to preserve something precious. Arthur hopes Tessia can understand, realizing that the road ahead will not be easy for them. He tries to defend himself, explaining that he doesn't think about things in the same way, and is confused by the extent to which he will be ready for this relationship. Tessia pointed out that she recognized this and felt some relief. Arthur stood up with a heavy feeling in his heart, revealing that he did not want to keep Tessia waiting, but only hoped to be given time. Suddenly, Arthur kissed Tessia on the forehead, which surprised her and made her eyes widen. The moment made Arthur feel that there was a warmth between them, and despite feeling embarrassed, he knew that the action came from genuine intentions. Tessia was silent, feeling the vibrations of the moment. She touched her forehead where the kiss had been, trying to understand the meaning behind it. Arthur's gentle treatment made her feel loved, even though their situation was still complicated. Arthur looked at Tessia, feeling the tension slowly dissipate. With one small promise in their hearts, they both realized that although the future was uncertain, they had each other to support. After that moment, Arthur felt a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. It was sudden, and he was still caught up in his feelings. As he walked to class, many of the Cyrus Academy students looked at him with strange looks, as if wondering what had happened to him. Arriving at the classroom, Arthur sat with a flat face, trying to cover up the chaos within him. Sylve, who was lying on the desk next to him, started teasing him about the kiss. Arthur just buried his face into the desk, wanting to ignore all the teasing. The lesson started, but Arthur was frustrated that the material was still the same as a week ago. His mind drifted away from the lesson, thinking only of the memory of when he kissed Tessia and all the feelings that came with it. He tried hard to focus on the lesson despite the restlessness inside him. Professor Drywell stood in the audience of students, expounding on the basic concepts of deviant magic with passion. His speaking voice echoed throughout the room, but the students' attention began to fade. Professor Drywell explained that deviant magic has tremendous potential, but can also be very dangerous if not used wisely. He wrote some formulas on the board and explained the possible effects if this magic was not managed properly. Several hands went up with questions, and Professor Drywell pointed to a student in the front row. The question of how deviant magic affects the user's body was answered in detail, explaining that this magic can manipulate the energy in the body and can cause negative effects if not managed properly. As the explanation continued, some students began to whisper to each other and looked uneasy. Explanation after explanation was given by Professor Drywell with great knowledge, but the atmosphere in the classroom was getting dull. Arthur, sitting in the corner, felt his mind drifting away from the lesson at hand. Memories of the time he kissed Tessia on the forehead continued to haunt his mind, making him curious about Tessia's reaction after the incident and whether Tessia felt awkward or vice versa. Worry and curiosity swirled around in her mind, disrupting her focus on the lesson. Sylve's voice suddenly calling his name startled him, making him realize the importance of the information for the upcoming exam. Arthur looked at Sylve blankly and replied reluctantly, realizing that he wasn't really listening. Inside her quiet room, Tessia sat in front of her dressing table, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She wore a hoodie over her head, as if to hide herself from the outside world. Her mind couldn't escape the moment Arthur kissed her on the forehead. Tessia remembered that moment, how warm and gentle Arthur's touch was. Her cheeks flushed, and her heart pounded every time the memory flashed through her mind. Tessia reminded herself that she should not expect more, but doubt and hope collided in her mind. She realized that Arthur's actions might not mean anything, but her imagination drifted further, imagining what if someday the two of them had cute children. Tessia was embarrassed by her thoughts and covered her face with her palms, trying to dispel the shame that spread throughout her body. She let out a long breath, trying to calm herself down and focus on her studies and the near future, despite her rebellious heart. A quiet night enveloped Cyrus Academy, and only the sound of the wind could be heard among the dark buildings. In a quiet corner, two students, a boy and a girl with paint buckets and brushes in their hands. They were doodling on the wall in bright colors, expressing their creativity without fear. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps could be heard approaching. They both turned their heads and were surprised to see Arthur approaching. With his tall stature and calm face, Arthur approached them, offering to join them. The boy immediately turned pale and ran as fast as he could, leaving behind the bucket that had fallen over and spilled paint on the ground. The female student was silent, showing confusion and tension. The girl then faced Arthur boldly, asking if he would report them. With a quick movement, she unleashed her magic power, preparing to attack. However, before her attack could be launched, Arthur calmly blocked her, making the girl fall to the ground in confusion and annoyance. Arthur shrugged his shoulders, his smile remaining on his face. He expressed his support for gender equality and offered her the option to come with him to the disciplinary committee office quietly. Before the girl could respond, Theo appeared dragging the male student who had run away. Theo explained that the male student did not have the symbol on his back, leaving the girl even more confused. Theo shook his head while carrying the boy and the girl away, leaving Arthur alone. Arthur nodded in understanding and said that he could patrol alone, as if not feeling burdened with his duties. The night was getting late as Arthur strode slowly along the pathways of the Tyrus Academy. His eyes were vigilantly watching every corner that might be a hiding place. Sylve, who always faithfully accompanied him, stepped beside him with a bored expression. Sylve's complaints of boredom, hunger, and sleepiness were clearly audible. Despite this, Arthur remained focused on his patrol. When Arthur realized that they were on Kay's patrol route, he felt like going back immediately and avoiding any additional trouble. Suddenly, Sylve felt something strange and jumped towards Arthur. Arthur picked Sylve up, and they hid, as a black-robed figure passed in front of them. On the man's legs was a striking symbol. Arthur held his breath, trying to watch without drawing attention. Sylve whispered excitedly, suggesting that they pursue the figure. Arthur calmed Sylve down, reminding him that rash action could make the figure realize their presence. He planned to follow the cloaked man if he had many members, until he found his hiding place. However, a call from behind made Arthur turn his head. He signaled Kai to be quiet, but when he looked back at the black-robed man, the figure had disappeared into the night. Kai, who had just arrived, asked why Arthur was on his route and why the figure he was following had disappeared. Arthur explained that he was following a black-robed man who might be related to Marcos, but the man disappeared after Kai arrived. Kai seemed dissatisfied with the explanation and reminded Arthur to inform him of the incident immediately. When Kai asks about Theo, Arthur explains that Theo is taking the pair of students who scribbled on the wall to the supervisor's office, so there are currently only 2 of them. Kai then suggested continuing the patrol despite the worry on his face. Arthur nodded, realizing that this night held many mysteries. They continued the patrol with cautious steps, staying alert to the possibilities that could happen. Tension was in the air, and they knew that something bigger was lurking in the shadows. The night was getting darker, and the atmosphere was getting tenser. When Kai asked again about the presence of patrols in their area, a yellow light suddenly emanated from Arthur and Sylve's pockets. Theo activated his dagger in preparation for a possible threat. Arthur felt a moment of tingling tension in his back and realized that the situation was getting urgent. Kai patted Arthur's shoulder, giving him encouragement and saying that he would try to catch the figure they saw. Arthur and Sylve quickly moved away, with Arthur giving the description of the cloaked man they were following and warning Kai to be careful. After Arthur and Sylve disappeared from sight, Kay's expression changed. There was something unreadable on his face, as if he was holding a bigger secret. He stood for a moment, contemplating the information he had just received. In the deepening darkness of the night, Kai prepared to face any possible danger that might arise. With strong determination, he continued on his route, determined to capture the mysterious figure that might threaten the Academy's security. Arthur and Sylvie strode quickly down the path they knew so well, towards their patrol route for the night. The night air was cool and crisp, with the scent of wet earth touching their noses. Their footsteps echoed softly along the path, broken only by the sound of dry leaves breaking in the night breeze. Upon arriving at the patrol site, they found an unexpected sight. Theo sat on a wooden bench, nestled in the corner of a seldom visited area, looking in great pain. His face was pale, and he was clutching the back of his neck with shaking hands. Curtis and Doradrea stood beside him, their faces filled with anxiety. Curtis, with his sturdy posture and serious expression, looked extremely worried, while Doradrea, with her characteristic calm face, showed obvious discomfort. Arthur walked straight up to Theo with quick steps and a look of deep concern on his face. He could see that Theo was in very severe pain. Theo turned his head with difficulty, his face flushed from the excruciating pain. Theo revealed that he had been struck with a powerful blow to his skull. With difficulty, Theo explained that the blow was very strong, like there was more power involved, perhaps coming from someone with greater abilities, such as an augmenter. Theo's skin was covered in cold sweat, and he struggled to stand up. Doradrea, who was still standing beside Curtis, explained further. He revealed that Theo was found unconscious and clutching the back of his neck. The blow was so hard that it caused significant bruising. Curtis added that although the perpetrator had already left when they arrived here, they still had to track him down to find out which of the students at this academy had done it. He looked frustrated and angry, as if he wanted to get to the bottom of this situation immediately. Arthur began to think hard about possible perpetrators. He considered that the perpetrator might be from a known group like the Marquis. If the perpetrator was an augmenter and came from Marquis, this could be a bigger problem than they thought. Theo, although in pain, agreed with the possibility, realizing that the blow was not what they were used to dealing with here. They agreed that this situation required further investigation. Arthur, Sylvie, and Theo stood near the bench where Theo was sitting, sensing the growing tension. Curtis and Doradrea were also involved in the rising tension, with their faces showing a mixture of frustration and anxiety. Curtis tried to understand the situation more deeply, asking if Theo had seen the appearance of his attacker. Theo, who was still in intense pain, shook his head, revealing that he had fought the perpetrator before passing out, but did not see his appearance clearly. Arthur began to reflect, thinking of every detail that might be useful in this investigation. He recalled that Kai might have had a cut on his hand, and Sylvie gave a small nod, reinforcing Arthur's thoughts on the possibility. Theo then asked about what happened in Kai's area, but Arthur felt reluctant to share more details about the hooded man he saw, feeling that the information wouldn't provide much help. Doradrea mentioned that although Kai's appearance was not very impressive, he was a fairly reliable man for a human. Doradrea's remarks sparked a small argument between Curtis and Doradrea. Curtis accuses Doradrea of being racist towards DC officers, and the tension escalates further when Curtis starts chasing after the fleeing Doradrea. Arthur and Theo can only look on in confusion as the fracas between Curtis and Doradrea unfolds, leaving them in a quandary amidst an increasingly complicated situation. In the Cyrus Academy study, the atmosphere became quieter. Arthur and Emily sat side by side at the desk, surrounded by study tools. Arthur seemed very focused, while Emily followed closely. Arthur started talking with tension about the possibility of not finding the suspected assailant and the hooded man. Suddenly, Professor Gideon appeared and interrupted their focus, making a mess of Arthur's tools. After leaving, Arthur and Emily feel confused and frustrated. Emily tries to defuse the situation by asking why Arthur seems unfocused. Arthur explains that he feels exhausted from the disciplinary committee issues. Emily gives Arthur a small item, which makes Arthur smile and feel better. Sylvie the little fox, who was also nearby, patted him on the face with Arthur's behavior. In the training room of Cyrus Academy, the atmosphere was noisy and full of energy. Students were practicing fighting under the watchful eye of Professor Glory. Arthur and Sylvie sat on a large rock, watching the training. Arthur expressed amazement that even though Marquis was involved, Lucas only got a short suspension. Sylvie, who was bored without Tessia, found the exercise to be boring. Arthur tries to cheer her up by mentioning that there is no patrol duty tonight. Sylvie expresses her concern about the usually stressful night patrol duty. Professor Glory approaches them and sits on the side of the rock where Arthur and Sylvie are. He explained that the council banned the raid into the dungeon he usually used, and that the raid would be conducted at a lower level than the usual one. Arthur was relieved even though the challenge might be lighter, and Sylvie seemed more cheerful after the conversation. After training, Arthur offered to help Tessia, who agreed to rest in the pool. Sylvie was already swimming happily when Arthur and Tessia sat at the edge of the pool, dipping their feet into the cool water. They talked about Tessia's feelings and the problem of rejection from her beast will. As the atmosphere became more relaxed, Tessia deliberately splashed water on Arthur's face, causing a light laugh. Arthur reciprocated by splashing water on Tessia's face, and they both threw water at each other playfully, creating a livelier atmosphere. However, as Tessia was about to stand up, her hand accidentally touched Arthur's, causing an awkward silence between them. The atmosphere became even more tense when the door to the training room opened, and Dr. Goodsky appeared in the doorway. Arthur and Tessia were surprised at Dr. Goodsky's presence, creating an awkward atmosphere around the pool with the three exchanging glances. When the door to the training room opened and Director Goodsky appeared, Arthur and Tessia were surprised. Tessia immediately approached Director Goodsky with a worried expression, while Arthur stood near the pool with rising curiosity. Director Goodsky explained that his arrival was not due to any serious issues, but rather just to warm up. He expressed his desire to spar in the Witch Guild's training room. Although he seemed relaxed, Director Goodsky emphasized that sometimes one needed a way to reduce stress. Tessia remained anxious and cautioned Director Goodsky not to overexert himself, fearing that he could get hurt. Director Goodsky appreciated Tessia's concern and promised to consider the suggestion in the future. Next, Director Goodsky turned his attention to Arthur, asking if his class would be starting soon and requesting permission to use the practice room that night. Arthur explained that it was not a problem as they had already completed the day's assimilation exercise. After Arthur and Tessia said their goodbyes, Arthur left with Sylvie. Tessia and Director Goodsky continued their serious conversation. Arthur, feeling that something was left unsaid, decided not to eavesdrop further and closed the door gently before leaving the room with Sylvie. Meanwhile, in class, Professor Avius politely but firmly interrupted Elijah's conversation, requesting that class resume. The reaction of light laughter from the other students indicated an atmosphere full of antics, but Professor Avius soon turned the class attention to a more serious topic. Professor Avius explained that one of their friends, Marcos, had recently experienced an incident that provided an important lesson on the dangers of using force that is not fully understood or controlled. Professor Avius stated that many mages and medical personnel were working together to find out the cause of the incident. He explained the technical dangers of forcing cores beyond their capacity, which can have fatal consequences such as muscle injuries from excessive pressure. Professor Avius emphasized the importance of understanding and respecting one's limits and using magic wisely. The class became silent as Professor Avius explained more about Marco's situation and the effects of overusing magic. A student raised her hand to ask if Marcos was still alive and if the mana-restoring elixir was helping him. Professor Avius confirmed that Marcos was alive and getting help from some elixirs, but emphasized that this did not necessarily guarantee salvation in every case. Professor Avius states that although some elixirs can help restore mana cores and reduce the impact of excess magic use, not all injuries can be fully healed. This explanation added depth and reflection to the classroom atmosphere, leaving the students with a better understanding of the risks and responsibilities of using their powers. Arthur listened to Professor Avius' explanation attentively, but something was nagging at the back of his mind. Although Professor Avius explained the dangers of using power in detail, it only covered part of a more complex issue. In the afternoon, Arthur entered the classroom with a firm yet relaxed demeanor, ready to start the next learning session. With a slight nod, he signaled the class to stop talking and pay attention. He began his explanation in an authoritative yet friendly voice, announcing that none of the students had managed to get close to the demonstration done the previous day. Arthur then decided to give a direct instruction by involving one of the students, Lester. Lester, surprised to hear his name being called, stood up and headed to the front of the class with a sense of doubt and curiosity. Arthur then explained the scenario to his students by using Lester as an example. He described a situation where Lester was a very intimidating opponent for an augmenter, and how it was important to use ranged tactics if not prepared to face the threat head-on. Arthur began practicing what he had explained. He took a piece of paper and a scroll from his desk. With a skillful movement, he blew the paper so that it flew up and hit Lester in the face. The paper stuck to Lester's face, causing boisterous laughter among the other students. Arthur laughed lightly with them, recognizing the effectiveness of humor in teaching as a way to break the tension and make the lesson more memorable. Meanwhile, in a room located in the interior of the academy, Lance Baron and Lance Alia sat in attentive discussion. Soft lamplight illuminated the cozy room, creating a calm yet tense atmosphere along with the topic they were discussing. Lance Alia asked the reason behind Lance Ferre's nickname for the two of them. Lance Baron, with a furrowed brow, explained that it might be related to the discovery he made on the outskirts of the Beast Glades, where he found something unusual. Lance Alia showed curiosity about this information, emphasizing his ignorance about the Beast Glades. While their discussion was still ongoing, the door to the room opened, and Lance Ferre entered the room in a firm but unhurried manner. He sat on the chair provided and looked at his two colleagues seriously. Lance Ferre revealed that the reason for their summoning had to do with significant discoveries in the deepest levels of several dungeons. The traces found indicated the presence of wizards who were not from Cathan, which sparked a sense of astonishment among Lance Alia and Lance Baron. Lance Ferre explained that they were still investigating the witch's activities, but the indications of a potential threat were clear. The expertise and knowledge of Lance Baron and Lance Alia would be invaluable in dealing with this possibility. The discussion then continued with questions and explanations, addressing the potential causes and implications of the discovery and the steps that need to be taken to investigate further. Shortly after, Lance Ferre added that their discoveries also included titanic bloodworm sightings at several locations in the Beast Glades. This creature was known to be a major threat that could alter the ecosystem and cause severe damage. This information sparked anxiety on the faces of Lance Alia and Lance Baron, who understood how serious this threat was. Lance Baron proposed immediate action to deal with the sighting, with concerns that if left unaddressed, this threat could endanger the adventurers and disciples. Lance Alia, with his courage and experience, offered to use his detection techniques to cover a wide area of the Beast Glades. She believed that her detection skills could identify the creature's presence more accurately. Although Lance Ferre recognized Lance Alia's abilities, he emphasized the high risks involved in working alone in such a dangerous area. Lance Alia demonstrated her confidence and willingness to take risks to prevent a greater disaster. The discussion continued with the division of tasks and strategies to deal with the titanic bloodworm threat. They planned how to detect and deal with this dangerous creature, as well as protect the adventurers and students from possible attacks. After all the tasks were divided and plans were made, Lance Alia prepared to investigate the Beast Glades. She was committed to gathering as much information as possible and reporting back to her comrades. The three Lances, with faces full of determination and seriousness, prepared for the challenges ahead, determined to overcome the titanic bloodworm threat to the best of their abilities. Anxious yet determined, they embarked on the next steps to deal with the looming threat to Beast Glades. The next day, the morning sun was just beginning to shine on Cyrus Academy, and Arthur and Sylvie looked sleepy as they entered the training area. Although their eyes were half closed, Arthur could not ignore the hustle and bustle in front of them. In the area, the members of the discipline committee were practicing vigorously. Theo and Curtis were engaged in a fierce battle that displayed incredible strength and speed. Their every move, from Theo's agile magic techniques to Curtis' physical strength, made up a fight that lasted up to 5 rounds, with each round getting more intense. Meanwhile, Arthur was frustrated with the gravity magic technique that he had yet to master. Despite trying various approaches, the technique was still elusive and mastering it felt like a daunting challenge. Theo and Curtis' practice came to a halt when Kai and Claire arrived, drawing everyone's attention with their presence. Although the atmosphere became more relaxed, Arthur remained immersed in his own thoughts. He felt the need to focus on gravity magic, but there were many things to consider and do. After the training was over, they gathered in the disciplinary committee room to continue the meeting. Claire started the conversation seriously, reminding them that their class would be traveling to the Beast Glades in a few weeks and would require replanning of the patrol route, as well as adjustments to the school schedule. Arthur nodded, understanding the importance of such planning. Claire explained the distribution of patrol routes and schedule adjustments. Kai and Doradria immediately volunteered to increase their patrol hours, showing their readiness and commitment to maintain security. The discussion continued with further details regarding patrols and the division of tasks, while Arthur listened intently. Arthur's mind remained on the elusive gravity magic technique, and he felt the need to find a way to improve his skills in order to contribute more. After all the planning and task assignments were completed, the meeting was closed with a clear agreement on the schedule and tasks. Arthur left the room with a sense of relief that everything had been arranged, although he still had to struggle to master the gravity magic that baffled him. After the meeting, Doradria approached Arthur in a confident manner, offering advice on traveling to the Beast Glades based on her experience. She warned Arthur about the unpredictability of many things, despite Arthur's basic knowledge. Catherine then approaches with a teasing expression, reminding Doradria of yesterday's lunch incident involving food stolen by rodents. The conversation between Doradria and Catherine soon turned into a small debate. Arthur, not wanting to get involved in the dispute, decided to leave with Sylvie, leaving the area as Doradria and Catherine continued to discuss. Arthur then approached Claire, who was standing near the exit, and asked her about the magic Kai was using. Claire explained that Kai was quite secretive about his abilities and only gave limited information regarding the metal wire Kai used. Arthur pondered, thinking about how the wire might hide magic attributes. Suddenly, Kai approached in an enigmatic tone, asking about Arthur's interest in him. Arthur answered honestly that he was curious about how Kai controlled his metal wire. Kai smiled coldly and threatened to kill Arthur after giving his answer. Arthur raised an eyebrow, questioning if that was a threat. Before Kai could explain further, Claire intervened sternly, reminding them that there were still classes to attend. With Claire's warning, the atmosphere calmed down again. Arthur and Kai stared at each other before Arthur nodded and joined Sylvie and Claire to their class. Arthur entered the training room with leisurely steps, his eyes searching for the whereabouts of Elijah, who seemed to be seriously practicing. Elijah was practicing with his sword, his movements sharp and focused. Arthur watched carefully before starting a conversation. In a casual tone, Arthur greeted Elijah and made a comment about Elijah's motives for learning magic. Elijah paused for a moment, visibly annoyed by the comment. Arthur chuckled while gripping his sword and added that although Elijah was a conjurer, it was also important to learn the basics of melee magic. Arthur's mockery sparked Elijah's anger. With a furious expression, Elijah launched a surprise attack at Arthur. His sword glinted in the light of the training room lamps as they began to fight. Their fight was intense, the sound of metal clashing and their shouts echoing through the training room. Arthur both praised Elijah's skill and taunted him, creating a confusing mix of feelings. The fight showed that Elijah almost managed to injure Arthur with his sword. However, Arthur was faster in his movements and eventually managed to knock Elijah to the ground. Arthur stood over Elijah and extended his hand to help him up. However, before Elijah could greet him, he suddenly felt a sharp headache, turning his facial expression into pain. Arthur immediately showed concern and asked about Elijah's headache. Elijah tried to endure the pain and explained that he was feeling emotional and had a simple headache from hitting his head. Although Arthur offered to take him to the medical room, Elijah quickly declined, stating that his headache was gone and that he was going home to shower first. With difficulty, Elijah stood up and waved at Arthur, thanking him for the match. Arthur returned Elijah's wave with a smile, remaining standing in place and thinking about the events that had just transpired. Elijah looked somewhat distraught, but also determined as he left the training room. Arthur watched Elijah's departure curiously, thinking that there might be more to understand about his friend. Their fight might have revealed something more than just fighting technique, a signal that there was an emotional tension he had yet to fully understand. These past weeks have been peaceful and relaxing for Arthur. Despite the approaching mid-cycle exams, his spirits remained high. As a developing mage, he felt grateful for the guidance of Toby and his teachers. His daily life, with the small moments and people he was beginning to appreciate, was the main reason for his happiness every morning. On a sunny morning in class, Arthur sat next to Elijah. Lately, Elijah seemed to be daydreaming a lot, and Arthur sensed that something wasn't right. Arthur decided to open the conversation gently, asking if there was a problem. Elijah turned his head with an expression that was hard to read, revealing that he was just a little worried about the upcoming exam. Although his smile seemed to be trying to mask his worries, Arthur sensed that there was more to him than just exam worries. Arthur offered his help and suggested studying together if needed. Elijah expressed his thanks for the offer. Sylvie expressed concern that Elijah had seemed rather angry with Arthur lately, asking if anyone knew anything about it. Arthur sighed, saying that he felt the same way and would try to find out more to make sure everything was okay. Sylvie hoped that this was just a minor issue that could be resolved soon. On that day, Arthur was in Princess Teshia's training room, having a training session with Teshia. Against the backdrop of impressive training equipment, the atmosphere in the room was serious and concentrated. Teshia stood in the center of the room with a face full of confidence, while Arthur was beside her, focused on their training. After some intense practice, Arthur could not help but praise Teshia's progress. He observed that the integration of the beast will in her mana core was getting more stable. Teshia felt proud of her achievement and expressed her gratitude. However, Arthur's expression suddenly changed when he snapped his fingers on Teshia's forehead. Teshia felt pain and groaned, trying to cope with the pain. Arthur admonished Teshia not to be too proud and to remain vigilant, explaining that this stability was the result of hard work, but did not guarantee ease in the future. Teshia looks surprised by Arthur's actions and asks about the reasoning behind it. Arthur explained that it was important to remain vigilant and keep honing your skills, as there were many factors that could affect your opponent's strength. Teshia accepted the advice and asked about specific suggestions for improving her mana core assimilation. Arthur explained that core mana assimilation can be very complex, and the key is to understand how beast will and mana energy interact. He suggested regular breathing exercises and visualization as ways to improve understanding and harmonization between beast will and mana. In a fit of rage, Teshia launched an attack on Arthur. In the inevitable chaos, Teshia accidentally pushed Arthur to the ground, and in an instant found herself sitting on top of the fallen Arthur. Seeing Arthur's smiling expression, Teshia felt even angrier. The atmosphere became even more awkward when a familiar voice came from the tent door. Teshia's grandfather, Virian Aerolith, entered the room with a surprised expression, commenting on the situation in a tone that was a mix of shock and amusement. Teshia immediately stood up, her face bright red with embarrassment. Arthur also stood up and asked Grandfather Virian about his presence there, who was supposed to be at the council meeting. Virian Aerolith, with a big smile and a soft laugh, explained that he had come to check on his apparently grown-up grandson. Arthur turned to Teshia with a meaningful smile and thanked Grandfather Virian. He proposed to continue training, although Teshia still felt awkward and angry. Nonetheless, Teshia agreed to continue the exercise with the caveat that she still disagreed with the idea of hiding in the tent. With a slightly lighter mood after Grandpa Virian's presence, Teshia and Arthur continued their training, although Teshia still felt a mixture of embarrassment and anger within herself. Suddenly, Virian's grandfather Aerolith informed him that there would be a dungeon tour tomorrow, and he had originally planned to send Cynthia to watch over Teshia, but Cynthia was doing something else. Arthur nodded in response, but then remembered that he had promised to visit his parents that night before leaving. Virian Erelith seemed pleased and suggested that Arthur take Tessia with him. To Tessia's surprise and disbelief, Arthur made it clear that he would not be involved in Grandfather Virian's plans and chose not to bring Tessia to his home. Meanwhile, Arthur stood at the door of his house, hesitating after deciding to bring Tessia to his home. He felt uncomfortable and confused by the decision. However, the decision was made, and he took a deep breath before pressing the doorbell. When the door opened, Arthur and Tessia were greeted with enthusiasm by Arthur's family. Arthur's mother, his father, and his sister stood in the doorway with big smiles. Alice Lewin greeted them warmly, and Elia, Arthur's younger sister, jumped for joy and pulled Tessia's hand excitedly. Arthur felt awkward and asked his mother how they knew Tessia was coming. Reynolds Lewin replied with a mysterious smile that they had expected Tessia's arrival and had prepared everything after hearing many stories from Arthur about Tessia. Arthur was surprised by the preparations his family had made. Inside the house, there were gifts and decorations prepared for Tessia's arrival. The Lewins tried to create a warm and welcoming atmosphere for Tessia. Arthur stood in the doorway of his house, feeling a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. Although his face still showed discomfort, his gratitude could not be hidden. Alice Lewin smiled gently, trying to make the atmosphere feel more comfortable. She stated that they wanted to make sure their guests felt welcome, emphasizing that Tessia must have heard a lot about them. The warmth and friendliness shown by Alice Lewin helped to ease the tension between them. Elia, meanwhile, eagerly drew Tessia deeper into the house. Elia couldn't wait to show her her new bow and the various new items she had bought. Tessia, though still feeling awkward about the situation, followed Elia with a small smile, feeling a little calmer at the Arthur family's hospitality. Arthur followed them at a slow pace, feeling a little distrustful of the decision he had just made. However, seeing how happy his family was to welcome Tessia, he felt a little more confident in the choice he had made. On the other side, Lance Elia stepped carefully into the narrow tunnel that echoed in silence. Each step was an echo that accompanied the distant sounds of footsteps and thunder. He paused at the intersection of the passageway, trying to determine the right direction. Confidently, Lance Elia chose one of the branches of the hallway and continued to move quickly. However, the floor beneath him suddenly shook, forcing him to slow down and be careful not to slip. The hallway she was traveling through began to curve and ended at the edge of a fairly high cliff. At the bottom of the steep cliff, Lance Elia saw a Hades serpent. The creature was different from any she had seen before, with large horns protruding from its head, giving it a terrifying impression. Lance Elia frowned, trying to remember the description of the creature. The Hades serpent was known as the guardian of the tunnels, but the large horns were never mentioned in her notes. She dug into her memory, trying to match the information she had. The Hades serpent was usually a large and powerful creature known to guard dangerous tunnels. This creature's horns were something new that she had never learned about. Lance Elia took out a communicator and contacted Lance Veray. In the communication, Lance informed her of the discovery of a large horned Hades serpent that did not match the existing records. Lance Veray, in a curious tone, asked Lance Elia to confirm whether it was another species or a new variation that had not been recorded. Lance Elia confirmed that the creature was clearly different from the general description and expressed his intention to continue the investigation and gather more information. Lance Veray suggested that Lance Elia be careful and report any additional details found, because if this was a new variation or species, they would need to know more about its abilities and behavior. After shutting down communications, Lance Elia rechecked her gear before continuing her investigation. With a sense of caution and determination, Lance Elia ventured deeper into the tunnels, trying to find out more about the horned Hades serpent and what might be hidden in these mysterious tunnels.